Hey everyone, welcome to this first episode of Rambles, which is a series where I go over all of the different blocks in the game, potentially units down the road. I just talk about the game of Mindustry and how everything works, maybe some of its in-depth concepts, and beyond that, I wouldn't use this guide as gospel, but I am going to cover a lot of the stuff that I have learned over the time that I've spent playing the game, which is now, I believe, well over 5 months. And I've been getting into some of the more advanced schematics more recently, so I feel like I finally have my own 2 feet to stand on when talking about this topic. Hopefully, it helps some of you new players out there to kind of get an understanding in video form for how to play the game a little bit better. So without further ado, I'm going to start covering the basics for what the regular conveyor can do. The regular conveyor is obviously found in the Conveyor tab. This appears different on multiple devices, but it's usually in the bottom right corner. The conveyor, as it shows up here, it costs for 1 copper. So it does cost something to build, even though it's one of the cheapest, the slowest working, most inefficient blocks in the game. It still costs something to make. That's very important for Ground Zero, and I'll explain a little bit more in a bit. It has a health of 45, build time 0.01 seconds, should be pretty quick, especially for the base and default ship. The item capacity is 4 seconds, and your move speed is 4.1 items per second. Now, one thing that I need to briefly mention about movement speed is that when it transports items, it's also based on your frame rate, but it largely bounces around the figure given for each of these conveyors. So for example, here we have the 4.1 items per second. It might be more than that by just a little bit in testing. Titanium conveyors can reach actually over 11 items per second, but it usually stays around 10.5 if you actually hover over one of these conveyors, and you see in the bottom right corner 4.5 per second, and it'll kind of bounce between 4.0 and 4.5. But ultimately, that is the highest achievable throughput that you can have on regular conveyors. Regular conveyors are used to transport some of the basic materials, assuming you're not using your ship to be mining them. And that starts out with copper and lead. Copper and lead are the 2 things you need in campaign the most early on. And the reason is so that you can unlock all of this fancy stuff right here. Now the bridge is the most important, arguably, but all of these other blocks have their uses. What bridges do is they transport items at the same speed as titanium conveyors, which is the 11 items per second. Maybe even faster, depending on how testing goes for you. Then we have overflow gates and underflow gates. The cool thing about these is that they don't actually occupy any space, and they basically instantly transport items between them to any output points within them. They'll get their own video, so I'll explain more how they work later. It's a bit logical. Same goes with sorters and inverted sorters, although they're less lenient as to where you can output and input items. Distributors are basically larger routers. They give you more space to work with if you want to send a lot of items a lot of different directions. And of course the router. We'll talk about that when the time comes. But ultimately, you won't be using the conveyor after you reach the mid-game and obtain titanium, from which you can make these titanium conveyors. And you can see here I have a list of all of these different kinds of conveyors that will transport items. So let me briefly give an example here. I'll set copper up to all of these, and while I'm at it, I'm going to make a full output of this here. There we go. Just so you have a better visualization of how these all work at their max capacity. You won't be able to see what's going on through these bridges, but they are transporting items, and it'll show up right here under the health of the bridge conveyor. The items flick for a half second, but you can tell that the items are moving. And just to be absolutely clear, there you go. The items are coming through. And they're coming through this area here too. So you compare the speed of a regular conveyor with the speed of all of these other alternatives, and it's pretty clear why it's not a great option to go with late game. That said, what can you do with the regular conveyor in maybe the early game? Well, we've got a bunch of different kinds of schematics here. And this is for like really early game. Maybe early in an attack map, maybe early in campaign. Maybe you and your friends are playing on a specific map and you don't really want to bother too much with thinking about the logistics of things, so you just stick with the original conveyors. Well, the first one that you're probably going to end up using is the graphite press. Now, there are so many different variations of this little contraption here, but it usually consists of 4 of these graphite presses, an underflow gate here, and an inverted sorter here. But ultimately, the throughput is always going to be the same. You are always going to get graphite at the end, and the 4 coal per second that you put out in the beginning is going to all get converted into graphite at a ratio of 2 to 1. It takes a little bit for the production time to go through, which is why you need 4 of them. So now moving on to silicon. This is perhaps one of the most important resources in the game, if not the most important. Here we have a 3 smelter design, but before we move on to that, I do want to showcase the 2 design here. Doesn't matter where you input these. So what's happening here is that this bridge is sending items downward and into this silicon smelter. And then this junction is making it so the sand can pass through this way without intersecting with the coal at all. So both of these smelters are getting fuel without being too much of a hassle. And then you're getting the silicon in return. So the coal actually isn't as needed here, since silicon smelters are at a ratio of 2 to 1. So you need 1 coal per every 2 sand. So because of that, the coal is limited to 2 items per second that are needed instead of just 1. As a result of that, you're seeing this as kind of like in half, but it's a little more complicated than that. I'll cover more of why those work the way they do later. But this is a 3 mixer design with a bit of a mixed bridge, because bridge conveyors have that faster throughput like I was talking about before. They are going to be transporting items into all 3 of these. Requires a bit more game knowledge to understand how this works over maybe this one, but ultimately they're very basic. I'll also be including links to my Steam workshop in the description if you'd like to get a hold of some of these designs. Here we have a pulverizer grid. It's rather simple. Maybe I shouldn't be inputting coal to those. Let's change that. And the final output is going to be roughly the amount of sand in return that we're putting in for scrap. So here you can see it now. So this is 8 sand per second, since it's using the 8 scrap that we're putting in. That's about all there is to say about that design. Now, in order to get the silicon smelters to even work, you need power. The first source of power that you're going to need in the game is coal power or combustion generators. It's a huge stepping stone for basically every aspect of the game. So here's a very basic design that works pretty perfectly. Input 4, and it basically powers this whole grid. And you can use that to power maybe the silicon or the pulverizers or any of these for that matter. But at some point you're going to need water. And the reason you need water is for both the cultivators and steam generators, at least in the early game. So for that fact, we're going to input our coal and water. Then as a result of all of this, steam generators create 330 power units per second. That's going to get fueled, and the ratios are perfect, basically meaning that all of these will be filled with coal, and the input of coal on a regular conveyor will not stop at any point. At least it's about as perfect as we can get it, since conveyor rates are based on frame rate. So here we have 1.7 to 1.8 power units per second. Pyrite is a pretty nice commodity to have, especially since it burns things, and in the early game you can use that to snipe cores without having blast compound. Or, you know, for that matter, powerful units. You don't have to invest too much to get what you want. Because early game attack cores don't really have any way to put the fires out, they just constantly burn. So it can be a pretty reliable strategy. But here we'll input the lead and the sand, which is needed for pyrite. And then something you can actually do to be a little bit sneaky is you can replace this battery right here with a combustion generator. And it's actually going to power all three of those because pyrite doesn't require all that much in the way of power. Here you can see 12 power units per second, and the combustion generator makes 60 power units per second. And in all reality, you're not going to need coal that much for this grid, so you can totally fit it in. Over here we have another scrap array that you can change scrap into sand from. It's basically the same ratio as the other machine, except it basically works the exact same way as the other one did. So there are 3 pulverizers per scrap conveyor, and that's making exactly what we need. So if you haven't already caught on, the idea in this game is to make it so that the input of your items is always at a decent ratio to what the output is going to be. Obviously with power that doesn't really matter. All you have to worry about is the input, and that is fantastic. You don't have to think too much about it. But with silicon and graphite, there are plenty of variants of these designs which all aim to achieve different things. So it can be hard to pick what you want. But generally speaking, what you're seeing here is almost a very dumbed down version of what you can use in the early game that will help you the most. I will connect that now. And it's going to be generating us spore pods. And it's a little weird to see what's happening here, but basically it's conflicting bridges because this is V6 and we can get away with that stuff. Here we have the blast mixers, and I need spore and pyrite, and we can put that over here. Now these are using unloaders, but it should be relatively okay. You don't need titanium conveyors for this, but you do need titanium to make the unloaders, which is a little unfortunate, but you need titanium to even make blast mixers. Still, it's an example of how you can make something small scale while still being mid-game. I wrote up a little note here to keep track of what I was talking about, because this is called Reach Rambles, but, you know, I'm going to miss out on some important information. So, the most useful part of regular conveyors is its use to distinguish how many items a player needs in a schematic. And alternatively, it can be used as a more makeshift distribution method, but its uses are more limited. So in other words, if you have a titanium conveyor here, let's just steal this and output it here. This is going to stack and back up, as we just saw. So let's try this, and then it's immediately obvious what's happening here. You don't really want that in most cases, but there could be a case for it if you have an overflow gate here, and it'll occasionally send items there. Or maybe you want a router, and you don't want that many items to come this direction, so you instead use a regular conveyor. Since titanium conveyors are 11 items per second, that subtracts it down to about 7 this direction. So it's like a makeshift overflow gate, if you will. Doesn't work all that great. But it could do what you want it to in very specific situations, like the note mentioned. And I think that's almost about it. Regular conveyors, they kind of lose their utility after the early game, because things like bridges are so easy to use. Now, normally you'd have to pay 6 copper and 6 lead, which normally is not a problem once you get your factories up and running, but once you're starting to get them into motion, they can be very difficult to obtain and use in mass. But I'll demonstrate their uses in a future video. Ultimately, you should only be using conveyors if A, you don't want the headache of using bridges before titanium and getting these conveyors down here, everything after this one. Or, you know, you've seen some of the bridge uses in the past, and you kind of just want to play the game in a non-cheaty way, because a lot of players view using bridges as a bit cheaty. That's the best way I can describe it. So I think that's about it. Thank you so much for watching. If you did appreciate this, be sure to leave a like, and it really helps other people find tutorials like this. I don't think I'm that refined yet, but hopefully I will be in the future. So I want to, again, thank you all for watching. Have a fantastic rest of your day. And, yeah, bye.